Hi, welcome to another edition of our Gesher Galicia Today podcast series. Today, we are privileged to have with us the distinguished genealogist Nolan Altman to talk about Holocaust records. My name is Stephen Turner, and I am the president of Gesher Galicia. Nolan and I served together on the board of the Jewish Genealogy Society of Long Island. Nolan was bitten by the genealogy bug when he was inspired to write his family history in 1996 in memory of his mother. After making use of the valuable information on JewishGen, he volunteered to do data entry on various projects. In time, he was asked to become coordinator of the JewishGens Holocaust database and subsequently the coordinator for the JOWBR, JewishGens Online Worldwide Burial Registry Project. Nolan currently holds the position of JewishGens Director for Data Acquisition and focuses on growing the JOWBR, Holocaust, and Memorial Plaques databases. In 2021, Nolan was recognized by the IAJGS with their Lifetime Achievement Award, the highest and most prestigious award in Jewish genealogy. In addition, the organization's Volunteer Award was renamed in his honor, the Nolan Altman IAJGS Volunteer of the Year Award. Welcome, Nolan, and thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Good. Okay, so we've all heard the myth that nearly all records were destroyed. Please tell us why that is a myth.
Well, that's what people think, that out of the rubble and the remains from World War II, that any documents that could have been available are no longer available, and it's not true. Depending on what kind of documents you're talking about, there are much more than just concentration camp lists. There are census reports, there are transit reports, there are forced labor reports, and also when we talk about the Holocaust, we also have survivor reports. So there are many organizations around the world that were helping during the war and after the war that put together lists of and the names of people, trying to connect families after the war, finding a place for some of them to live because they couldn't return to the homes that they had. And so there are plenty of records that are available. And quite frankly, I couldn't even tell you how many are available because maybe even the majority are not indexed. So there are still records that are being found, and there are still records that are being worked on in terms of being indexed so that researchers can find names of interest within those records.
And one of the groups doing that indexing is Gesher Galicia. We have an active Holocaust project that I'll talk about later. Now, you made a point of saying that when you're looking for Holocaust records, you have to be aware of when the Holocaust started in the area you're looking at and when it ended. You want to expand on that?
Yeah, well, it was kind of interesting because when you talk about Holocaust records, people think about World War II, but others consider, the Holocaust period to start before World War II. It could start in the mid 30s. And when did it end? Did it end at the end of World War II, or did it end when the last DP camp was closed, displaced persons camp? And that's as late as 1957. So when we talk about Holocaust period records, it's much a longer period of time than just the period of World War II. And all of those records may be of interest to individual family researchers.
Right. Okay. And you make a point, and I think this is a very important point, that uh, not all records are public. So it's very important to contact the repositories of the records to find what may not be public.
That's right. There are some records that either by agreement with the archives that have those records or with certain organizations that the records not be made public and not be put on the internet. Now, a lot of those rules and restrictions go back to when the internet first started, and I think some people were a little shy about having all their records online. But until those change, until somebody questions it and tries to change that, there are still lists that are not available. There are also lists that some institutions hold that they consider to be somewhat sensitive. So, for instance, there are lists of those Jews in camps that were assisting the Nazis in the camps, not because they wanted to, but because they made a life and death decision. Those lists would not be found on the internet, as lists like that. So, if you contact the archives and you tell them what it is you're looking for, there's a better chance that they will then look at some of those other lists that are not made public so that you get a better chance of finding from the comprehensive set of collections that are out there rather than just what might be online.
Right, right. Now, I want to say that as we go on in our discussion and we talk about various sites and archives, there's a handout to this podcast on the introductory page, and it has all the links to the organizations that we're going to talk about and the societies and everything. And please make use of that when you don't have to write it down and pause the playback of the podcast to write things down because it's all on the handout. Okay, now obviously one of the most what largest and most important repositories of Holocaust records is JewishGen, which has at last count I think about 5.9 million records. Okay, and they have different data sets. You want to describe the different data sets?
Sure. The Holocaust database consists of over 400 different data sets. So when we get a set of records, they could be camp records or transport records. Each one of those is a separate set of records. Each one of them has a separate introduction, which explains to the researcher a little bit of the background on what that set includes, the fields in the database, where it came from, so the source, and the archive or the repository or the researcher that did the work so that they would have a place that they could actually follow up to get more information. So there are over 400 of these individual component data sets that make up the close to 6 million records in the Holocaust database. If you were to search on JewishGen, you don't have to search for each individual set. You just search the Holocaust database and it goes through all of the different component databases. Or you can use now, we have a unified search on JewishGen, and you can search there and it will show you any records that come up. If you're searching by a surname or a town, it'll show you which records pertain to the Holocaust database.
And there's a source documents present on the site. You want to go into a little bit about the source documents?
Well, by the source document, I think you mean the introduction.
Yeah.
So that introduction is really important because generally when we get a data set, we're just getting the data. We don't get and we don't keep source documents. So if you were to ask for a copy of the page where a relative might have been on, or you want more information than we're providing, if there is more information, then the introduction will give an acknowledgement to the archive that shared that information with us, and it'll give their collection number. So you can contact that archive or organization and you can refer to the collection set, which will make it easier for them to find it. It's a lot easier for them than if you just gave them another name again and they would have to do a search all over. And you've got a better chance then of finding the page or the document that you were looking for.
In general, how good are the archives in responding to queries from individuals?
It all depends. It depends on how much staffing they have, and it depends. During the COVID period in time, people weren't even going into the museum, the Holocaust Museum in Washington. I don't know what the situation was around all the others, but there were limitations on getting their hands on actual files and microfilms and whatever the source data was kept in. So I imagine, it's much better now than it was a couple of years ago, but I don't have any idea what the backlog might be.
Okay. Okay. Now there are various lists that come with Holocaust records. You want to go into some of the lists that people can look for?
Sure. Like I mentioned, when you think about, if you think about the occupation as they came into a town, there might be a census report that was taken to figure out who all the Jews were in the town. Then there might be transport lists if they were transported out to either camps, death camps, or work camps. There might be, so those would be transit lists. Then there might be other forced labor lists, because some of these census reports documented also what the professions were of the people that were in the town, so they could figure out whether or not they might be able to use them for other purposes for their own, war efforts. Um, there are other lists that have to do with hospitals that were run in ghettos. I think Lodz, we have a bunch of those. Any kind of list, and they were very good about keeping lists. So any kind of list that was made for one purpose or another, if we were fortunate enough to be able to get them, then we would add them to the Holocaust database. So it's not unlike, let's say, JOWBR, where if we have 6 million records, it's 6 million pretty much unique records because a person can only be buried once in a cemetery. In the Holocaust database, an individual could be on a whole bunch of different lists. They could be on a census report, on a transit report, more than one transit report, more than one forced labor report. If they survive, they could be on a survivors report. So, it's 6 million records, but not 6 million unique individuals.
Now, would you say that there are usually more documents from work camps rather than the death camps?
I would say some of the death camps, when we got later into the war years, the camps were basically just used for death. So people were pretty much taken from the trains to the death areas. In the work camps, you've got actual transit forms, and you've got people being moved from one place to another. And so they're pretty much like inventory lists, manifests. And so you might have more records for those who ended up working in one place or another than you might for a death camp, where there might not be any records for individuals.
Right. I think it's important for people to understand that a camp like Auschwitz, which was obviously a major death institution, uh, also had many factories there that people worked at. So Auschwitz, compared to other camps, had many survivors who were then able to tell the stories. So we hear more about Auschwitz. A camp like Sobibor, as you mentioned, where the victims came on a train and were marched right into the chambers, there are hardly any survivors, and then you don't hear that much about those camps. So people should bear that in mind when they do their research, that that there are many camps with very little information about, because there were very few survivors from them.
And I think another thing that most people don't realize is how wide the number of subcamps were. So there were, tens or hundreds of subcamps in some cases where people could have been moved to or from. There are a lot of the sites that we have on the list have educational information. And it's part of the programs involved with the Holocaust Museum and Yad Vashem and some of the other organizations is to educate the public. And so if you were to take a look at any one of those sites and look under their education references and resources, you would be able to see, read about all the different subcamps that existed. And you might be surprised that there were as many as there were, and even with the work camps, how many times people were transferred between different work camps. It's not like you just went to one camp and that was the end of it. A lot of people were moved around quite a number of times.
People had a big resume of what camps they were in, and it's really, if you try to trace where they were during the war, you need to trace all those camps to look see what's available from these camps.
I'll give you a short story about, something I found really interesting. When I first started doing the indexing for the Dachau set, we got that from the Holocaust Museum. So it was a set of records that showed all of the inmates that came through Dachau. And they were incredible records because they had their surnames and given names, they had date of birth, place of birth, where they lived. It had their prisoner numbers, it had why they were put into the camp, and then it had their disposition. And so when we first were doing this, I used to get these scans, individual scans from the Holocaust Museum, and I would send them out to volunteers, usually 10 at a time. And I gave them a template and they would put the information into Excel and they would send it back to me and I would send them another set of 10. Well, there was one volunteer that I had that I would send it to him in one day and he would send them back to me the same day. And it got to the point where he said, you know what, send me an extra 10 or 20 so I don't have to wait for you to send me another set. So I said, fine. And I finally got up the gumption, I guess, to ask him. I said, is there something special about this camp? You know, is there some connection that you have with it? And he wrote me back and he said, yes, I was there.
Wow.
And then I went and I found his record. And then he started telling me about all the different camps that he was in. And so, you know, the volunteers for JewishGen are really the lifeblood of the organization. And you just never know, you know, when you're dealing with somebody who's got an interest in records, are they doing it for family research? Are they doing it for personal reasons that they want to, you know, memorialize what happened and keep the memory alive? So it really hit home when he told me his story.
Wow, wow, that is some story. Well, the lifeblood of any of our organizations with Gesher Galicia too is all volunteers. Gesher Galicia is all run by volunteers. I mean, we have contractors that we pay to do certain things because we're not in the lands where the records are kept, but it's all run by volunteers. And I want to put out to the public that Nolan has on his handout an address to write to him if you're interested in volunteering and helping out, because he's always looking for more people to volunteer, and we are also. Okay. So tell me about using Kahila links for your Holocaust research.
I'm
That's a
sorry, you
vital
see.
source. Kahila links.
Well, Kahila Links on JewishGen is a section that is devoted to individuals who want to start their own website for a town, but they don't necessarily have the technical know-how or they don't want to be bothered with doing their own website. So Kahila Links will set up a town page for you on which you can put all kinds of information having to do with the town. Typically, the information that's going on these pages would not be searchable indexed items. So it could be pictures, it could be narrative histories of the town. In those narratives, there could be information about the Holocaust, and there could be photos from the Holocaust. So the Kahil Link sites are another good place to take a look if your town is listed there, to see what kind of information might be there that you would not normally find doing a database search through the JewishGen databases.
Now, I want to add to that. Not only are the Kahila links important, but there are Statal study groups, research groups that have their own websites. If you want to know whether your Statal has a research group, uh, Google is probably the best source. Just Google your Statal name and put the word Statal in it, and see if there's a research group. Because I could tell you, like, I founded a research group for the town where my father was born in, Nonconventional, and we have a lot of Holocaust data on our group website and stories and articles that people wrote about. Uh, Alex Feller started the Rohatyn District Research Group with tons of Holocaust records on it. Marlon J. Osborne started Rohatyn Jewish Heritage with much information on the Holocaust in Rohatyn. So if your town, if you're lucky enough for your town to have a research group, that's another great source to find. And Kahila Links might have a list to excuse me, it might have a link to a research group if there is one, but I would use Google or use any search engine just to find out if there's a research group for your town, because that's a very important place to look.
You know, another place where you might be able to find a research group for a town, when the IAJGS has its annual conference, now it's getting back to its normal schedule, the Share Fair that's usually the first day of the conference, invites all research groups along with research divisions and all, the other major genealogical organizations, commercial and nonprofit, to display what they have and to communicate with other researchers of interest. So if you were to look at any of the old sites, even going back to 2024's conference in Philadelphia, if you look at the Sharefair listing, you might find that there's
Or the BOF listings too, where there might be groups,
right, birds of a feather
birds of
would
a
be the
feather.
smaller groups, right? So that might be
That's a
another
good
place where you
point.
can take a look.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
And if you're interested in starting one, all it takes is just finding another group of people that have the same interest in the town that you do, and you can start a BOF group.
Right. And I'm gonna make another podcast. I'm gonna be talking with Alex Feller about how to start a research group with your own website and stuff like that, and where to go to find other descendants of the town, because that's a great way to keep in touch with other descendants. And like in my case, and for Nadvorna, we have about 150 people in our group, and then we even made a trip to Nadvorna after the Warsaw IAJGS, and we had success stories of putting branches of family back together that didn't know that survived the Holocaust, and it's a great tool that more people should try to use. Okay, now ghettos had censuses. Okay, probably most of the ghettos had some kind of record of who was there, because the Germans were very meticulous, as we know, and they wanted to know who was there. Some of those censuses survived. Many of them did. Now you have many of them on your JewishGen site, and Gesher Galicia has many of those for Galician statals. But you want to talk a little bit more about the census lists?
Yeah, we mentioned that it would be logical for them to figure out who's in the town when they take over a town and occupy it. I couldn't tell you that there was a census made in every town or when it was made. I only really know about those that we received data from. So certainly the larger cities had them. Some of the smaller towns had them, and it's possible that many more had them, but I just never got access to them. So I just couldn't confirm that, there's one for every town that was occupied during the war.
Right. Now, if you are doing research and you're going to look for a census list, understand that many Jews in the small towns around a larger town, when the ghettos were formed, were brought into the ghettos in the larger towns. So, for instance, in Stanislav, there was a ghetto with many Jews from the surrounding towns. So even if your ancestor was not from the city, you might still want to check the census list of those cities, because they might have been deported there.
I think one of the lists that we all found kind of unusual that I didn't talk about was the Jehovah's water bills.
Right. I was just about to bring that up.
Oh, were you? Okay.
Yeah, yeah. You say Borislav and Rehoboth. You have water bills for. You want to
Right.
go into that? Go
Right.
ahead.
So I don't know who figured it out, but somebody realized that there were these water bills from 1941 that showed delinquent balances. And we have them in the Holocaust database. And the question was, well, why would you put delinquent water bills in the Holocaust database? And the answer was because these people no longer lived there, and obviously they weren't paying the bills. And so they ended up on the delinquent water bill list. And so now you have the names of people and their addresses that used to live there, when they were occupying those homes and paying for their water bills. So sometimes thinking outside of the box or thinking laterally might end up getting you records that you never thought of as Holocaust, era records.
Yeah, and the irony is that they try to collect those bills if the survivor came back and tried to get their property. Um, okay, so let's talk about Yad Vashem for a while. Okay, Can you go into the best way for someone who has no experience with their website to try to get information about their ancestors from Yad Vashem?
So Yad Vashem obviously has a number of different purposes. The overall purpose is to memorialize the 6 million. And we don't know what that number is, right? We don't know if it's 6.2 million or 5.8 million or whatever it is, but their purpose is to memorialize and preserve the memory of all those individuals and those Jewish towns. They accomplish that by doing a number of different things. They have educational resources online. They have digital databases, which include pictures and films. But the best known database that they have is the one that comes from the Hall of Names. And pages of testimony are forms that were filled out by either survivors of World War II or by relatives or friends of those who may have perished during the Holocaust. And those are used to populate this the Hall of Names. And so their database includes information that you might not find in other places. For instance, children, right? Or very young newborn children. At that point in time, people were not traveling to an administrative capital to go register a birth. So how would you even know that they had any? Well, in these documents, if somebody was a relative, they probably would have listed all of the people in that family that would have been there. Now, these are obviously no way are they comprehensive because it would take somebody to know, these individuals. But chances are that if it was a family member, they would have put down all of the people that they knew that were lost. And what's really interesting is that not only do they list their nuclear family, but they list extended family names, which would obviously have different surnames. So there might be links to other family groupings that you didn't know about. And what I found most helpful is that the submitter's name is also on that form. And why that's important is because you can do a search by the submitter. And so I was looking for a family group and I found the group, but I found the person who submitted the information was a cousin of the family group. And then when I searched on him, I found all these other extended relatives because one way or the other, they were all related one way or the other. But they had different surnames, which I would have guessed and never would have known. So finding search results by the submitter is one of the aspects of that database that's pretty unique and I find incredibly helpful to find extended family members.
And talking about submitter information, I myself have reconnected with lost family by finding submitter information for. It's a long story to go into, but my father's sister uh, was killed in the Holocaust. So I put a testimony in for her when I was in Israel, when I was in college. So after Yad Vashem digitized their inventory, and I went back and looked at the testimony, I was going just to look at the one that I did, and I saw someone else put in a testimony for my aunt, for the same person. And then we did a search, and we found the person, and they lived near Haifa. It was my aunt's husband's nephew, actually brother, man's husband's brother. But then I got in touch with the nephew because the brother was no longer alive, and it's a great way to reconnect. I wish Yad Vashem would make it easier to work with that. And I know Logan Kleinwax was put a proposal into Yad Vashem to sort of make it easy to do a search and for people to put contact information eh, to for people to be able to speak with and contact the submitter of the testimony. But Yad Vashem was not interested in that.
I think all these organizations are a little bit gun shy about using living people's information, especially, contact information. So to the extent that we're talking about people who perished during the Holocaust, that's one thing. To talk about people who might have given information is another. If you go on the site and they're actively still, trying to find more information from people, and who better to find that kind of information than genealogists and family researchers. But if you go on the site, you can actually download the form, and the form says on it that the submitter's name will be made public. So I imagine there could be some people who know stuff and don't want to submit information
Right.
because they don't want their name out there.
Right. Now, if you haven't been to the Yad Vashem website in a while, I want to tell you that they have a new format. They redid it, and I actually hate it. I
Okay.
was used to their old format. Maybe it's because I was just used to it, but I don't find it to be as intuitive. So it might take a little time to do the searches. It took me more time to do the searches that I was doing than it used to be under their old format. So beware when you go to the Yad Vashem website.
It's funny
They,
you say that because on the old website, I found I would do a search one day and then I would come back another time and do the same search and I would get different results.
yeah, I did see that too.
Or I couldn't find what I found the first time. So I don't know if this one is more stable, but I did find that the first one was the older one was a little bit glitchy.
Right. Well, that's the way the IT is set up to do the search of a query. But the way they display the searches is was the problem that I have. But yes, it's quirky. There's no doubt about it. Okay, now what about the U.S. Memorial Museum in Washington? That's also a great site to look. What's the best way to use that site?
Yeah, they also have a separate section that is just for their database. It has victims and survivors database. The site itself is very easy to use, and it also functions based on searches of names and towns. They've got also plenty of educational information. They do a lot more sharing of information than some of the other organizations, and many of these organizations do share certain lists with each other. So I think their site might have the Spielberg Shoah Foundation testimonies. I think they also have some connections with the Australian Holocaust Center. I may be getting this mixed up, but there are some centers that do share information. So you might be able to find information on one that would also be on the other. If it's a shared list, I wouldn't imagine that the information is going to be any different. But if they've done them independently, then it's always worth checking. It's just like if you're looking for census reports on my heritage and ancestry, if somebody independently transcribed it, they may have read things differently. So there you might have different responses for the same source document. If they're just sharing lists, then it's just a duplication of the individual records.
What's the best place to go to look for survivor testimonies and interviews?
On the handout, we have a whole listing of survivor testimonies. So the Shoah Foundation has some. I think it's Yale has a collection. Yad Vashem has a collection, and some of them are pretty extensive in that they've actually had people sit down and listen to them and call out from the transcript all the names of individuals and the names of towns. So you can actually do a search by a town name or an individual and see whether or not somebody referred to a person or a place within a transcript. JewishGen has a listing of the index. We don't have the recordings, but it'll take you to the USC, University of Southern California Shoah Foundation site to listen to the actual transcripts. And you never know, who might make a reference. It's just like reading a Yisker book. You may find a name in there that has something to do with your family, that just because somebody else happened to mention them as a neighbor or a butcher or a baker or whoever.
Okay, well, since you mentioned Yiska books, that's a good segue into New York Public Library records, where all the Yiska books are held, and many are translated on JewishGen. And talk about using Yiska books for Holocaust research.
Yeah, JewishGens books are incredibly good resources for getting a better understanding what life was like in the town. So, if we're not talking about a big city, if we're talking about shtetl life, there are a number of different sections in each book. One of them, the first section typically talks about the Jewish community and the history of that town. And they might even have little census reports, not names, but just how many Jews lived in the town and when the Jewish population started. Then there are submitted stories, narratives by people who either lived there and maybe left before World War II or survivors that made it after World War II. And they put in stories about what life was like in the town, what holidays were like, about trade organizations that might have been in the town, sports groups, schools, headers, all normal life types things. And these are written not by historians, but by individuals. So you can really get a better flavor for what life might have been like in that town, what market day was like, what a big event that was. Then there's a listing towards the back that's called a necrology. The necrology is a listing of all those who perished during the Holocaust. This is another place where you're more likely to find children's names that might not be anywhere else, because these children might not have ever gotten birth certificates, might not have been recorded in registers anywhere. So you may see in this listing the names of complete families. All the information in these books are submitted by family members or people who lived in that town, which means that it's, again, not necessarily a comprehensive listing of everybody, but only those people whose names were submitted. The last section of the book typically has a bunch of photographs. And these are people who either took photos with them before World War II or even post World War II, might have had some photos. Even as late as going into the War of Independence, there might be pictures of relatives that would be somehow connected to your family. The books themselves are mostly written in Hebrew and Yiddish. Some of them have been translated, more and more of them are being translated. So the New York City Public Library, the Dorot Jewish Studies section, has online scanned copies of every page of all of the books that they have. And if there are, when they did the scans at least, if they had English translations of the books, those are on there as well. So I would definitely take a look at the New York City Public Library Dorot section resource for JewishGens books. It's on the handout, and see whether or not your town is there. And if you have trouble reading, if the names are in Yiddish, it's pretty similar to Hebrew, but if you have trouble reading it, I'm sure there are people online in any of the Facebook groups or in your own individual genealogical societies or groups that'll be more than happy to help you with the transliterations.
I find in the JewishGens books, besides looking for data of survivors and victims as such, that the personal stories are so touching.
Mm-hmm.
I could tell you in the Nadvorna JewishGens book, there's one story of a survivor who came to New York City after the war, and the Nadvorna Landsman Society had a little shtibel on the Lower East Side, and he went there. And he was not a religious man before, and then they gave him an aliyah, and all the people from the town from the congregation were coming up to him and asking, what happened to this person and what happened to that person, because this was right after the war, and he broke down because every person he had to say had passed and perished. And but they're touching stories of survivors of people who were hiding during the auctions and everything like that. So if you really want to get a flavor for what happened in your ancestral shtetl during the Shoah, there's no better place than a JewishGens book to go to for that.
We kind of take it for granted in the age that we live in terms of information and connecting with people, but no internet, no telephones for a lot, not even knowing where these people were, if they were alive or not. How would you contact somebody if they no longer lived in the place where you knew that they lived? And how would they know to contact you if they couldn't get mail out or they couldn't get, some kind of communications out? And so, some of the other lists that we have are just postings in newspapers of people trying to find other people. And, some of those newspapers were known for putting those kinds of notices in, and people would go and check them and see. It's putting yourself back in that mindset as to what would you do if you were trying to find, a survivor. It must have been a very, very difficult thing to do.
Right. And talking about trying to find survivors, it probably the place that was most has the most records and stuff on that would be the Arelson archives, with their extensive uh, research into DP camps and records pertaining to that. You want to talk a little bit about more what you could expect to find in the Arelson archives and how to work with them?
Yeah, the Arelson group in Germany is they're trying. Their goal is to try to be the place to go for Holocaust records. So they are interested in trying to obtain as much as they can about the Holocaust. But they have extensive correspondence from people after the war looking for survivors. And so they will have, letters and whatever they could find from lists that their researchers were looking for, trying to match up survivors with those corresponding with survivors. Their website is also online, free to use, like all these other organizations. They also have other digital files having to do with pictures and movies, and other correspondence. Um, the the information that's at Arelson is supposed to be within each of the 8 member countries that was on the international, I think it was the IRC committee. And in the United States, it's the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. So the records at Arelson should be in the Memorial Museum as well. So same thing for Yad Vashem. Not all of the 8 members wanted all the records, but those who asked for them did have access to them. And since I know Arelson is trying to grow their collection, I don't know how currently, like if Arelson adds a collection, do the other members automatically get theirs?
Right.
Which is why it's still important, I think, to check each one of these different repositories to see if somebody has something that maybe one of the other ones don't.
Right. Now, there are a lot of worldwide Holocaust centers also. They're not the big ones, but those are worth looking into as well, right?
Yeah, you never know what you're going to find. There are Holocaust centers around the world, and there's even a worldwide Holocaust Center organization, which is like an umbrella organization. But some of these individual centers have records from their local area, which would be interesting that maybe some of the bigger ones don't have. Many of them focus on artifacts. So things that maybe survivors kept with them or were found with, or people who left before the war might have. So many of them, like the one in New York City, Lower Manhattan, that is mostly artifacts as opposed to records, individual, unique records. But especially if you're looking at a certain area, whether it's a country or a country where the Holocaust took place, or a country where many of these survivors went to, it's certainly worth taking a look in those individual archives.
Okay, so I think we've covered most of the conventional places to go to, but you speak of the non-conventional places to look. You want to go into that a little bit?
Well, doing some of this work, I found some what I called non-conventional. When you're going into the cemeteries and you're doing the work that we do for JOWBR, you may see on some headstones it'll say "Survivor of the Holocaust," and there's typically there's 2 or 3 symbols that you might see on there. But what a lot of people have done, what a lot of survivors have done, when they pass away, on their headstone, they may record those family members who perished during the Holocaust, because those individuals obviously don't have a burial site and they don't have a headstone anywhere. This is the way that those family members are preserving their history, their memory. So on a Holocaust survivor's headstone, you may find Holocaust victims' names, which is, you'll only know it by finding them in the cemetery. They're not going to be listed anywhere else because they're not buried in that cemetery. Same thing holds true for memorial plaques. If you go into a synagogue, you may see that there may be a plaque that was put up in memory of somebody, and it'll probably say either a victim of the Holocaust, or you'll see a date of death. It'll just say like 1942, which is a pretty good indication that there was a Holocaust death. So that might be another place where you could find information on a Holocaust death. We're trying to add in the memorials and plaques database in JewishGen these other types of memorials that would preserve the names of individuals. So there are plenty of memorials around the world, especially in Eastern Europe, where a town may have put up a memorial to the Jews that died in that town. And since these were put up by the people in that town, they're more likely to know the names of those people. And so again, you'll see the names of individuals, the names of children, the names of people that may have been deported out of the city. All of those are potential data sets for the Holocaust Memorials and Plaques database. So those are a couple of the places that people may not think of in terms of Holocaust records because they're not paper records.
Right, right. Okay, so now I want to speak a little bit about what we're doing at Gesher Galicia uh, in terms of Holocaust research. I added to Nolan's handout some links to Gesher Galicia to our Holocaust project. And we also have an inventory of what Holocaust records we have. I'd like to read to you the type, and there's a link to that. I would like to read to you some of the records that we have in our inventory. There are vital records. There are birth, death, and marriage records. As Nolan said before, people didn't go in general and register births, deaths, and marriages during that time. But believe it or not, the years right before the murders actually started, whether there was occupation, uh, there were a lot of births and there were a lot of marriages and of course deaths, and we have some of those vital records. We have doctors' questionnaires where people in the ghetto or in the labor camp had to be examined by a doctor to see what kind of work they could do, and we have some of those doctors' questionnaires. We have correspondence that were sent to people in camps. We have some of those listed. And we spoke of lists before, and we have many lists on our inventory. We have deportation lists, transport lists, forced labor lists, etc. And we have some of the ghetto censuses that we spoke about before. Some of those for Galician towns we have. And we also have something that's called the Book of Punishments that there were in the ghettos. A lot of punishments were handed out to people who didn't obey the rules. And we were able to obtain some of those books. Now, all these records are indexed on the All Galicia database. And if you search the All Galicia database and we have a record for the person you're searching, it'll come up. And if you have any questions about any of this, you could send an email to info@geshergalicia.org, and we'll try and help you. So for Galician research, you have to go to JewishGen, and you need to go to Gesher Galicia as well. Okay. Now, I want to talk about Nolan. I don't know if you've heard about this NKVD project that Gesher Galicia is doing.
No.
Okay, so the NKVD was the precursor to the KGB. It was the Soviet secret police. Now, Dr. Andrew Zulski, a former vice president, has conceived of, and he's running this project. And this project was awarded the Rabbi Malcolm Stern Grant at the IAJGS in Philadelphia. And when World War II started, Poland was invaded from the west by the Germans and from the east by the Soviets. So they each had an occupation zone. So the records we have are from the Soviet occupation zone. Now, when the war started, many Jews, thinking that the Germans were not the people I want to live under, started to flee to the Soviet-occupied zone. And the Soviet-occupied zone didn't want them to come in. So many of them tried to be smuggled in, and they were arrested. Okay. And then there were many that were in the Soviet zone that when they got there, they didn't want to stay there because life wasn't so much fun in the Soviet zone, and they wanted to go back to see family and their houses and stuff like that. In the German occupied zone, they tried to go back and they got arrested. Okay, and the life in the Soviet zone of was very, very difficult, and many Jews with businesses and all were arrested and sent to Siberia or to the gulags. And of course, that was a horrible thing for them when it happened, but it ended up saving their lives because although they suffered greatly in the gulags, they weren't being murdered, and if the conditions didn't murder them. So these files that we are going through have pictures in them. They have mugshots. They have correspondence, letters from families. There could be 70, 80 pages. And it's an incredible resource. The first batch of files, we're going through them, translating them and indexing them, are going to be released later this year in December. And I don't know how many people saw the TV series We Were the Lucky Ones, but two of the characters in that series, which was a true story, were arrested and sent to a labor camp. And there are just a tremendous amount of information in these files. It's like the genealogy file that I've seen, because I've seen a few of these files. That is the most incredible file of all the genealogy files I've ever seen. So keep on the lookout for next month for those records to come online. And also, Tony Kahani, our former research coordinator and chair, he's doing a record of a project of vital records from Lviv in 1941 to 1942. So under the Soviet occupation, there were vital records that were listed, and these are going to be listed there. And it's not just for Lviv, it's for the whole region, the whole Galician region. So there's a lot out there for you to look for, and there's even more coming. So don't give up if you haven't found what you're looking for. It may very well be out there or coming soon.
You mentioned correspondence, and I just wanted to throw out. I know when I was doing my very first oral interview, and I had my list of questions that I was asking my aunt, I never had anything on there asking about any correspondence that she may still have from relatives overseas. And through letters that my father had found in the basement, way, way after when I first started, that's where I was able to put together all this information about family that lived in Poland in the 1940s. I had no idea about these people and wouldn't have had any idea about these extended people had I not gotten copies of these letters. So if you have family that might still have a scrapbook or letters or, any kind of personal diaries that maybe does reference or includes, the time that they spent overseas or from other relatives, that would be another great source of information. I had the opportunity of meeting with one descendant, one person who married into the family who survived the Holocaust, the only one that I ever spoke to. And I find that most people, when you ask them about it, they'll either be happy to tell you because they want you to know the story, or they don't want to talk about it. They don't want to relive it. And in this case, she really didn't want to talk about it at all. And so it was very difficult to get information from her about what life was like. But the thing that I walked away was how glowingly she spoke about the Russians. And at the time when I was talking with her, it was an odd thing to hear, in the 1990s. So I realized later on that it was because her towns were liberated by the Russians coming in from the east, as opposed to those that came in and liberated the towns from the west. And for her, it was just obviously it was Freedom Day for her. She was liberated, and that's what got her on the way to ultimately ending up in the United States.
Right. You make a very good point about people not wanting to talk about it. But I think what's happening many times, not all the time, of course, what's happening many times is as these survivors are getting older, and
Mhm.
unfortunately there are so few of them around now, they're getting more inclined to want to talk about it. When it was too raw with them, when they haven't processed it, it was just too painful. Okay? But now they want to get their stories out and they want to
It's
share.
also true for non-Jews as well. I know that there are a lot of people that have gone back to some of these towns, and they would, before where you'd say, "How did you not know that there was a camp in your backyard?" Basically, and they would have said, we didn't know anything about it." Now they're telling the stories about what happened and what the occupation was like and all of that.
Father Dubois in Yechad and Unum, he does a great job going. He's a Catholic priest. Him wearing a collar, going to these towns, gets these people to open up and to talk. And in many cases, it's therapy for them because they've held this inside of them and they want to get the story out. Well, thank you, Nolan. This was, I think, very interesting and educational for people, and hopefully we could help them with their research. Your email address is on the handout if people have questions. My email address is there, and there are people here to help. Call on us to help, and thank you, Nolan, and for all the work, great work you do, Yasha Koach, and. May you continue to do this till 120.
Well, thank you very much, and good luck with your research.
Okay. Thank you. Okay.